On a gloomy evening in March 2010, paramedics were summoned to a quiet residential address outside Pensacola, Florida. What they found when they arrived, investigators would later say, was unlike anything they had ever encountered in their careers. A 19-year-old woman had emerged from the forest alone. She had walked nearly a mile through total darkness, with burns covering 90% of her body. Her skin was literally sloughing from her frame. She collapsed on a stranger's porch, whispered for him to call for help, and then she did something that would break every person in that courtroom 2 years later. She asked about her children. Her name was Audreanna Zimmerman. She was 19 years old, a mother of 2, and she had been lured from her home that night by someone she believed was her friend. This is the story of what happened to her, and the woman who decided that a neighborhood dispute over a stun gun was worth a human life. Tina Lasagna Brown was born in July 1970 in the American South to 2 young parents who, by most accounts, were not ready for the responsibility of raising children. 11 months later, her brother Willie Jr. was born. 2 small children raised in a home that was never stable. They were frequently left unattended or sent to relatives while their parents focused on their own lives. Despite being barely a year older than her brother, Tina took on the role of caretaker early. She prepared meals, helped with homework, and walked him to school. In a home without structure, she became the structure, but there was one thing she could not protect herself from: her father. By the early 1980s, Willie Sr. had become deeply involved in crime. He sold drugs from their home, and in 1982, he violently assaulted Tina's mother, Lily. The attack was so severe that Lily left that same night. She filed for divorce and walked out the door, leaving her children behind. With Lily gone, life inside the home became even more difficult for Tina. It was harsh, unstable, and deeply damaging. Desperate for help, she fled to her grandmother, believing she would be protected. Instead, she was turned away, told her father would never do such a thing, told not to come back, so Tina returned home because she had nowhere else to go. Years later, her father remarried. His new wife, Melinda, brought a different kind of influence into the home. She introduced Tina to drugs at a young age, and over time, Tina was exposed to situations that no teenager should ever experience. Money, survival, and poor decisions became intertwined. Tina Brown was still very young when she learned that the adults in her life would not protect her the way they should have. That lesson would shape everything that came after, and it would never fully leave her. As the years passed, instability continued to follow Tina Brown. Her father was eventually arrested for his involvement in criminal activity. For a brief period, Tina moved back in with her mother, Lily, but the reunion did not last. The two struggled to get along, and before long, Tina found herself back on her own again. She moved between relatives, changed schools multiple times, and tried to piece together some form of normal life. Eventually, she earned her diploma, but by that point, the damage from her early years had already taken hold. As she entered adulthood, Tina was already dealing with addiction, something that had been introduced into her life at a young age. She became involved with a man named Greg Miller, who was also struggling. Together, they had children, but their situation was far from stable, and the environment they were living in made things even harder. During her 3rd pregnancy, something shifted. Tina entered a rehabilitation program and gave birth to her daughter, Brittany, while in treatment. For a while, it seemed like things might change. She made a difficult decision to allow her first 2 children to be raised by her mother, while she focused on rebuilding her life and caring for Brittany. And for 4 years, she stayed clean. She worked as an assistant manager at a catering company. She created structure. She provided stability. For the first time, she was living a life that looked different from everything she had known before. But the pattern did not disappear. She entered another relationship and it quickly fell apart. There were more legal issues, more instability, and eventually a return to the same cycles she had tried to escape. There were arrests, there were setbacks, and once again, she found herself pulled back into the same environment she had worked so hard to leave behind. By 2005, the court ordered her into treatment for a second time. And by the summer of 2009, at 39 years old, Tina Brown made yet another attempt to start over. She packed her things, took her teenage daughter Brittany, and moved to Pensacola, Florida. She found work at a bakery and moved into a mobile home park on the outskirts of the city. It was a fresh start, but the income was not enough. It was never enough. And slowly, the same pressures began to build again. She returned to survival, using the only methods she had come to rely on: Among the people connected to her during this time was someone very close to her neighbor, a detail that would later become important, because by the end of 2009, everything was already beginning to unravel again. Just next door to Tina and Brittany lived a 19-year-old woman named Audreanna Zimmerman. She had been born on April 13th, 1990, and her early life, like many others in that environment, had its own challenges. But by the spring of 2009, her focus was clear: her two children, 3-year-old David, 2-year-old Trinity. She was raising them on her own, with very little support, in a mobile home park, trying to make things work day by day. And despite everything, she was trying. When resources ran short, which was often, she turned to the people closest to her: her neighbors, Heather Lee, Tina Brown, and Tina's daughter, Brittany. Over time, these 4 women formed a fragile support system. They shared food, watched each other's children, and relied on one another in ways that people often do when life becomes difficult. For a while, it worked. Audreanna, in particular, trusted Tina. She saw her as a friend, but the environment around them was unstable. Tensions built quickly, arguments became frequent, disputes over money, over relationships, over responsibilities, sometimes over cheery nothing at all. Police were called to the area more than once. It was the kind of place where small problems didn't stay small for long. Then came a turning point. Tina filed a report with Child Services, claiming that Audreanna was not properly caring for her children. For a young mother already struggling, this was serious. An investigation could mean losing everything. Audreanna was furious. The conflict escalated. There were arguments, property damage, retaliation on both sides. And despite attempts from Heather Lee to calm things down, nothing held. Then another incident pushed things even further. A situation involving Brittany's boyfriend created new tension between them. A confrontation followed, and during that moment, a stun gun was used in self-defense. When Tina learned what had happened to her daughter, something shifted. She didn't call the police, she didn't try to resolve it. Instead, she made a decision. And from that moment on, things were no longer just arguments between neighbors. They were moving towards something far more serious. In the days that followed the stun gun incident, Tina Brown did not let it go. She held on to it, she thought about it. And slowly, she began to plan. This was no longer about an argument between neighbors. It had become personal. She spoke with her daughter, Brittany. She spoke with Heather Lee. And at some point, she made sure she had access to the same kind of weapon that had been used before, a stun gun. It was kept inside the home, hidden away, but ready. At the same time, Brittany shared details of what was going to happen with a younger friend. She made it clear that this was serious, and that it was not something to be talked about. The message was simple: stay quiet, or face consequences. Then, on the evening of March 24th, 2010, Tina made a call. She reached out to Audreanna. Her tone was calm, almost friendly. She suggested they put everything behind them, that they move forward, that things didn't have to stay the way they had been. For someone who had been dealing with constant stress, conflict, and isolation, it sounded like relief. Audreanna wanted peace. She wanted the tension to end. She wanted things to go back to normal. So she agreed. That night, she walked out of her home and headed next door. The distance was short, just a few steps. A familiar place, a familiar door. She knocked. Inside, they were already waiting. At approximately 9 o'clock that evening, Audreanna Zimmerman stepped inside Tina Brown's trailer. Within minutes, the situation turned violent. She was overpowered and unable to defend herself as multiple people acted against her at once. A stun device was used repeatedly, causing her to lose control of her body and collapse to the floor. As she struggled, her ability to call for help was taken away, and she was struck multiple times. What began as a confrontation quickly escalated into something far more serious. She was then forced outside and placed into the trunk of a car. The vehicle drove away from the mobile home park, heading roughly 1.5 miles into a wooded area. When the trunk was opened, she tried to escape. She ran, and for a moment, it almost worked. But she fell, and they caught up to her. What followed was a continuation of the attack, using both electrical force and physical objects. The level of force used was extreme. At one point, even one of the attackers was injured during the assault. Then, the situation escalated again. One of them returned to the vehicle and came back carrying gasoline. At this point, Audreanna was still conscious, injured, but aware of what was happening around her. The fuel was poured over her, and moments later, It was ignited. The group left the scene believing she would not survive. They got back into the car and drove away, but they were wrong. Somehow, against all expectations, Audreanna Zimmerman survived the initial attack. She managed to put out the flames and get back to her feet. What happened next would leave investigators stunned for years. She walked, in the dark, through the woods, for nearly a mile. Despite injuries that should have made movement impossible, she kept going. Eventually, she reached a nearby home. A man inside, Terrence Hendrick, noticed something outside and stepped onto his porch. At first, he couldn't fully understand what he was seeing. Then it became clear. Audreanna was severely injured, barely able to stand, and in urgent need of help. He called emergency services immediately and stayed with her while help was on the way. And during those moments, she spoke. Not about herself, not about her pain. She gave names. She identified the people responsible. Clearly, directly. She made sure that what had happened to her would be known. Emergency responders arrived and rushed her to receive medical attention. She was later airlifted to a specialized burn center where doctors worked to save her life. At the same time, investigators began processing the scene. Evidence was left behind. Objects used during the attack. Personal items. Traces that led directly back to the people involved. When authorities arrived at the mobile home park, they found Tina Brown calm and composed. She claimed everything was fine, that nothing had happened, but the story began to fall apart quickly. There had already been a call. After returning home that night, Tina had contacted someone and described what had taken place. That person refused to get involved and instead contacted law enforcement. Piece by piece, the case came together, and at the center of it all was Audreanna's voice. Because even in the most critical condition, she made sure the truth was heard. 16 days later, on April 9th, 2010, Audreanna Zimmerman passed away from her injuries. That same day, arrests were made. Tina Brown, Brittany Miller, Heather Lee, all taken into custody. In 2011, Heather Lee made a decision. She pleaded guilty and agreed to testify against Tina Brown and Brittany Miller in exchange for a reduced sentence. In court, she described what had happened and her role in it. She claimed that the plan had not been intended to go as far as it did, and that things had escalated beyond what she expected. The jury listened, and in the end, Heather Lee was sentenced to 25 years in prison. Tina Brown, however, took a different path. She did not plead guilty. She did not accept responsibility. Instead, she maintained that she had been at home, watching movies, and that nothing had happened. Her trial began in June 2012. But as the case unfolded, that version of events became harder to maintain. Witnesses came forward. Testimony was given. Even individuals close to her provided information that contradicted her claims. A younger witness spoke about what had been seen inside the home that night and about being warned not to speak about it. Other evidence continued to build. Her own statements shared with someone after the incident were brought forward. The prosecution presented a clear and consistent case. The defense attempted to focus on her past, her upbringing, and the difficulties she had faced throughout her life. They argued that these experiences had shaped her actions. But medical evaluations did not support the idea that she was unable to understand what she was doing. The conclusion was clear. She was aware, she was in control, and she made her choices. After deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict. Guilty, first-degree murder. The recommendation was unanimous. The sentence, death. Because Brittany Miller had been a minor at the time, she received life in prison with the possibility of parole review after a number of years. Before sentencing, Tina addressed the victim's family. She expressed regret and acknowledged her role in what had happened. But for the family, no statement could undo what had been lost. There are some cases that stay with the investigators long after they are over, not because they are complicated, not because they are difficult to solve, but because of what they reveal about people. Tina Brown's life had been shaped by instability from a very early age. She experienced things that would have affected anyone. She was exposed to environments that offered very little guidance and even less protection. That much is clear, but Audreanna Zimmerman also faced challenges. She was 19 years old, raising 2 children on her own with limited support in difficult circumstances. She was trying to build something, to create stability where there was very little, and she deserved the chance to continue doing that. In her final moments, she did not focus on herself. She made sure the truth was known. She identified the people responsible. and she held on long enough for that to matter. Her children grew up without their mother, and that is the lasting consequence of what happened. A decision made in anger, in a place where tensions had been building for too long. If there is anything to take from this case, it is this: the most dangerous thing is not always a weapon, it is a person who no longer sees others as human. Stories like this are difficult to hear, but they matter because they remind us what can happen when conflict is allowed to grow, without limits.